Hello again. I had a look at the Harry Potter AI story and went to the place that produced it, which is botnik.org. I'll link that in the description. Very funny. I found this one that's a kind of fiction from the New York Times. It's kind of set out like the New York Times and it's an AI piece. So I thought I would read it as it seems quite amusing, and it's called My Marriage Was Just Dinner. The first time he texted me words, I knew he wanted us to talk. We met at a fairly long bar. The bar was one of those themed restaurants where the theme is that it's 700 feet long. He slid over to be next to me, but it took 8 minutes. Have you ever had sex with a fiddle? He asked me. I shook my head to say no. Well, honey, I guess nobody is perfect, he said, and kissed me as if I were bleeding out and he were a hungry animal in the night. When I look for a man, I use my eyes. He was built like a brick housekeeper with mortar for days and a deck that could hold a crowd. His hair was missing, but he wasn't bald. I told him there'd be Persian cats physically installed against every wall in my apartment. Oh, I see, this is like cat person. And he shook like a wheelbarrow fish. Certainly his eyes were wet, but agreeably so. He looked less like he'd been crying than if he had been swimming in salt water, and was sad he had to towel off. On our second date, we went to a cafe in Greenwich Village, where we shared a joint and a sorority wink. When he kissed me, his mouth was full of smoke and his eyes were visible in his head. It's a good start, it's what I look for. He slid his arm around my body, and I was lost in my desire to become a priest. But I felt God in his arms, and in that moment, I chose my own struggles. One night, months later, we stopped for gas, and he apologised profusely for all the shouting matches he'd had with my Bichon Frise, Maurice. His voice cut into my ears like a warrior's mighty punch. He said maybe it's finally time to read books about Gloucester. I listened harder, hoping to hear something about coyotes. His dad was a government guy who couldn't keep on trucking and had to sit down every few minutes. I loved that. I thought about how his chest was an old English teacher and I wanted to kiss it. It's a bit like magic realism, this. I wasn't sure what was happening. My parents hated him, my friends hated him, I hated him. But his wife was cool, so we kept on dating. Dearest, let's get married and start a family of fiercely independent goats, he offered one day. He said nothing about coyotes playing in the desert, but I could easily imagine that he had, so I looked past it. My heart swelled over my hip bones and spilled heavily on my lap as I gave my answer. Yes, I think I have to marry you so that I can join a big, successful union in the future. We got married in a room with a priest and many people named Lauren. The church was made of wooden wood. The priest didn't protect my purity, but he did give me a magic ring that symbolises rowdy marriage. You could say our wedding was like a billiards game. I put him in the corner pocket for our vows. One day he divulged that he had 2 years earlier been a stand-up. I didn't know what to do. I was ashamed for him. My husband has never felt my dry spot. When I begged him to touch my personal desert, he said, "No way." His taste in erotica? Let's just say it referenced Eraserhead a lot of the time. It's my publisher, Eraserhead Press. Then he left me. He smiled and said he was struggling with some 80,000 essays on the history of Yiddish. He had secretly become Jewish. He said he would write to me from his new apartment upstairs. He said he wanted a big brother, and I just wasn't that. I realised that my happiness depended so much on his second-hand couch and coffee table. I wanted to keep them, but they didn't want to stay. That's the way it goes in a relationship that's stopped being. It's just sadness. When I think back on it, especially after learning that his ex is very terrified of nitrogen, I see how we didn't entirely relate. Oh, I've lost my spot. He needed to always be selfish about the kinky pink sweatpants. I liked staring out at the university doctor who would sleep on our front yard. Oh, running out of battery. A relationship is like a pillow. You are supposed to keep it in the laundry room, hide it behind blankets, and when they ask how long before the other partner feels obligated to make clear that this is really annoying, say, "That is for me to feel out." It was a difficult thing to understand, but love is a big kidney bean in a strange pot of soup. Love is when we both cry at lawyers.